explaining what the Pro Seminar is and what our theme is this year. So, welcome to the second presentation in our Spring 2018 lecture series for the Pro Seminar in Social, Political, and Humanistic Inquiry. For a decade, the Pro Seminar has provided advanced students in social studies the opportunity for intensive interaction with scholars and practitioners active across the broad spectrum of the disciplines. Through lectures, symposia, seminars, readings, discussions, excursions, and scholarly writing, the Pro Seminar aims to nurture an intellectual community that bridges scholarship and citizenship through critical engagement with problems that impede the development of a just and sustainable global civil society. This semester, our working title is Undisciplined: Social Thought in an Age of Global Infrastructure. And our guiding question is, quote, what should social thought be and what might it become in an era of radically expanding techno-social networks? The 21st century is emerging as an international struggle for global hegemonic influence over infrastructure, the apparatus of trade, finance, mobility, communication, and military power, among other connective assemblages and networks. This is recognizable in several forms, including, and this is not a comprehensive list, the growth of massive and monopolistic technology companies such as Amazon, Facebook, Google, and Twitter, the continuing imperial reach by Russia and the United States in multiple tentacular forms, both overt and covert, and the construction of an energy and trade network with global reach in the form of China's One Belt, One Road project. Global networks generate new concentrations of wealth and power, but also less legible and more pervasive claims on ourselves as subjects of and to a global technocracy held up as benign and emancipatory for all who are willing to invest our minds and bodies in the labor that we call work, and the acts of consumption that we associate with livelihood, entertainment, and play. This tune, the leitmotif of globalization, shades every aspect of our lives. It is invasive. Critical aspects of emerging global infrastructure depend on unquestioned concepts and demarcations, symbolic capital of a new order of scale and magnitude rendered in forms most pleasing to the eyes, ears, and taste buds. These offerings are synchronous with and constitutive of a disciplinary crisis in the social sciences, a situation demanding robust, thorough, and even undisciplined responses based on creative interdisciplinary restructuring and transdisciplinary vision. Our guest tonight is a cultural geographer who has long embraced transdisciplinary research for the critique of physical and symbolic infrastructures of modernity. Focusing on China, he has generated critical ideas and insights that have been applied globally, particularly with regard to regional cultural development, culture industries, tourism, heritage, and regional and place-based identities. Most of his work focuses on the ways culture is used as a resource for development and governance objectives, identity politics, and tourism. He recently co-edited a book called Making Cultural Cities in Asia, which, as the publisher's blurb says, quote, examines the vast and largely uncharted world of cultural, creative city-making in Asia. It explores the establishment of policy models and practices against the backdrop of a globalizing world, and considers the dynamic relationship between powerful actors and resources that impact Asian cities. The book examines these processes through the lens of assemblage, how the policy models of cultural and creative cities have been extracted from the flow of ideas, and how reinvented versions have been assembled, territorialized, and exported. This approach reveals a spectrum between globally circulating ideals on the one hand and the place-based contexts and contingencies on the other. These are the kinds of themes that you'll learn more about this evening. Before I introduce the student who will provide a more proper introduction for our speaker, I want to share a few personal memories of the speaker as an undergraduate student in China in 1984. It was just 6 years since Deng Xiaoping led China into the period of opening and reform, and we were both enrolled in the Duke University Study in China program, which was in its second year. In the summer, we lived in Beijing and studied at Beijing Teachers College. In the fall, we lived in Nanjing and studied at Nanjing University. Mornings were packed with Mandarin training. Afternoons were devoted to Tai Chi, painting, music lessons, and exploring the cities by bike, bus, and foot. I think he would agree that we were astonished by the friendliness of the people, especially outside of the institutional spaces of academia. The laborers, the farmers, people who had suffered a lot during the Cultural Revolution, but seemed extraordinarily resilient and hardworking. They were friendly. They were really friendly with us. They spoke to us. They praised our fledgling Mandarin. We learned more outside of the classroom that could be accommodated than could be accommodated by a formal course. That's how I felt anyway. The program included some group travel, but much of China was off limits to foreigners. There was much that the government considered too sensitive to expose to the world. On many a weekend and holiday, our speaker and I would try to travel on our own, which sometimes meant we had to sneak around the government security apparatus, police checkpoints at the city limits, and the like. We both sought the mountains and wild landscapes beyond the cities, but it was unclear what we might find. He grew up in Boise, Idaho, exploring the northern Rockies, and I had grown up in North Florida, spending summers exploring the southern Appalachians. We both sought mountains, so our excursions took us first into part of the Taihang Range near Beijing, and then into the Qinling Mountain Range near Xi'an. One thing I learned by traversing parts of the ranges with our speakers is that growing up hiking and climbing in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina is not the same as growing up hiking and climbing in the Sawtooth Range in the Northern Rockies. Our speaker was usually hundreds of meters ahead of me, striding over boulders and fallen trees with effortless grace and strength. This I was not accustomed to. Having someone who's hiking way out in front of me is like, what's going on? Luckily for me, our speaker never showed a single sign of impatience or hauteur toward this relative flatlander, and we learned a lot by going where we were not supposed to go. Camping on a small mountaintop in rural Hebei province, we were awakened at dawn by imperious commands and martial music issuing from a village PA system in the valley below. Much of the countryside, which we were not permitted to visit, was still quite poor and regimented, even as it was emerging from the system of communes, work brigades, and work teams into a system of household contracts and free markets. Sneaking into what had been a Taoist monastic complex on Huashan in the Qinling Range, until the People's Liberation Army captured 100 of their nationalist army foes on the summit in 1949 and placed the banner of Marxist-Leninist Maoism on the summit of the mountain. Lacking a proper visitor's pass and failing to cross a deep chasm to enter the cluster of 7,000-foot peaks holding the old temple complex, we waited until nightfall and snuck into the mountains with a group of very friendly Chinese college students equipped with flashlights. I think he would agree that we found the temples, monasteries, and hermits' caves magical, and we loved the fact that you had to ascend many a high, steep cliff holding onto a chain and pulling yourself up by hand with the aid of footholds long ago chiseled into the granite. We played bamboo flutes in a cave carved into a cliff centuries ago, suspended thousands of feet above the chasm. Had we walked into an Orientalist fantasy? Of course. In a certain sense, yes, but not only. Descending the mountain in broad daylight, as workers blasted away parts of the cliff to broaden the narrow stone pathways into staircases for the coming droves of tourists, we knew that escape into colonial or post-colonial fantasy was untenable. He was more cognizant of this than I. As we both became geographers, his path took him with characteristic speed into the heart of what it means when we seek to escape the modern condition by traveling into spaces of otherness that embody elements of the real and the imaginary, and always entail power asymmetries, but not always in the ways we imagine. Our paths within the discipline diverged a bit, but he's always been up ahead and nearby. And with 21st century technology, I can text or call him on the trail, and he says, keep going, keep walking. Yeah, it's hard, but there's a lot to learn about this place. And he's not just talking about China. So watching him teach in the pro seminar was just amazingly fun for me, and just remarkable. Talking about Lefebvre especially, and everything, these articles on planetary urbanization and infrastructure and everything. I won't go into that, but you'll get a lot of that right now. But, so, let me introduce the person who will provide a more professional and complete account of our speaker's accomplishments. One of our very own pro-seminarians and a student whose work also exemplifies rigorous commitments to social, humanistic, and political inquiry, and that is Felix Breidel, who is a sophomore, recently moderated into Politics and Science and Society, the second of which he has designed, but I think we badly need here as a concentration. He has taken intermediate and advanced courses in politics, political economy, political ecology, geography, and critical theory. Let's give Felix Breidel a warm welcome.
Tim Oakes is Professor of Geography and Director of the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Author of Tourism and Modernity in China, he is also the co-editor of numerous volumes, including Translocal China, Travels in Paradox, The Cultural Geography Reader, Faiths on Display, and Making Cultural Cities in Asia. His articles appear in the Journal of Asian Studies, China Quarterly, Modern China, Society and Space, and the Annals of the AAG, among others. He has held visiting professor positions at University of Hong Kong, Guizhou Minzu University, National University of Singapore, Wageningen University, and the University of Technology, Sydney. Oakes' work to me offers a critical analysis of the expansion of neoliberal capitalism in our current day and age, critically examining the construction of urban landscapes. But Oakes refuses to fall into pessimism, and rather than look at global capital as a totalizing hegemonic force, rather sees possibility in spaces in which alternative politics are possible.
That's fantastic. I really don't need to say any more than what's already been said, other than to, well, a couple things. First of all, I want to thank the students in the pro-seminar for just a fantastic discussion that we've had over the past couple hours. It was incredibly enriching for me, and I wish we could just kind of keep doing that for a while. So hopefully some of that spirit will continue through in this evening's talk. I also want to thank Chris for inviting me. I want to say, you know, the reason I'm a geographer is largely to do with Chris. When I got back from China, spending some time in China, and was thinking about graduate school and thinking about what kinds of things I wanted to do in graduate school, and I had no idea what kind of a discipline would be an appropriate field for me to do that in. I gave Chris a call because he had recently gotten married, and I'd missed his wedding because I was in China. And then I said, you know, what are you doing? And he's like, well, I'm starting a geography program at Louisiana State University. I was like, geography? What the hell's that? And so he kind of walked me through what that whole program was about, and I said, that's it. That's exactly what I need to be doing, and the rest is history. But the other thing that Chris really needs to take more responsibility for is my interest in China. We were in the same program together, and I don't remember how far ahead I was in the hiking. But it should be stated for the record that I might have been ahead in the hiking, but the reason we were in those crazy places in the first place was all because of him. I never would have had the nerve to do the kinds of things that we did if it hadn't been for this crazy guy egging us on. And I guess we made a pretty good team. But you know, China was just at that time, both at that time in China's history and that time in my history, were both really critical times. And it was just a fantastic, fantastic place, and that's largely due to kind of the inspiration that Chris provided. So thank you for that. All right. And I have to show you something before we move on. So here we are. I can make it bigger too. Here we are in Huashan, and Chris was just describing that. And so that is from 1984, and there he is. At one with the spirits.
Wow.
So how many years ago was that?
That was 34 years ago.
34 years ago.
That looks like the...
He hasn't aged a bit, has he?
That looks like
He's wearing the same clothes.
shoes with the rubber sole, the bullshit.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
So this is really fun for me to be able to, to be here and to talk to you all. So let me go back to the show and start the more formal part of the presentation. And what I want to say by means of an introduction to this talk is that, I've been working in China obviously for a long time, and most of my work has been in rural areas of China, in rural Guizhou province. But it has become something of a truism, I guess. Anytime you spend, for anyone who has spent a lot of time in China over the years, urbanization is something that has become unavoidable. The city, if you think you can get away from the city by going to the countryside and staying in villages and things like that, the city will come to you. And that's kind of what has happened to me. And so I've kind of been going through this shift of some of the things that I've been interested in pursuing in China and starting to look more and more at the whole process of urbanization. And so that's kind of what this talk is a moment in that process. We hear a lot about the kind of crisis of identity and crisis of belief in China, in the kind of vacuum that has been left by the kind of ideologies of Maoism and even Marxism to a certain extent. That nothing has really replaced that in terms of what people can really believe in, except for maybe nationalism and now Xi Jinping. It seems like cities have become something that people really, really believe in strongly, and that means something a lot. And the whole process of urbanization has kind of taken over Chinese society, and not in just physical terms of the actual landscape and just what it's like to be there, but it's gotten into people's heads too, in terms of how people think and what their imagination is of the future and where things are going. It's all that has kind of been colonized by the city and by the ideas of urbanization. So I want to start with this very simple idea that the city has become the principal ideological device in China today. It is the most important ideological device that is doing kind of what I think of as ideological work in China today. Whereas under Mao it might have been some version of the kind of Maoist thought or Marxism or something like that. Now it is just the city itself has become ideological. And to kind of start us into kind of understanding that a little bit, I want to play a video. And I don't think there's going to be sound. I'll run the sound off my laptop as loud as I can. The sound is just kind of a soundtrack. But this is, well, I don't think I need to explain it too much. Oh, wait. Now I need to get away from it. Okay, hold on. What I will do is, let me just show it for a sec. Sorry, this isn't seamless like it should be, but here we go. Now we will watch video. And I don't have sound at all. That's weird. Oh, yes, I do.
It's pretty good, I think.
If we have the bandwidth to do it.
Yeah.
We'll do the projector and the speaker.
city if we had the bandwidth to keep up with the rapid pace of development that is going on. It's over enough that you get you get the idea. Let's go back to this. So this is the most straightforward and obvious kind of idea of the kind of the ideological work that the city does in China today. This is a promotional video for the Lanzhou new area, which is an entirely new city being built next to the city of Lanzhou, which is the capital of Gansu province in China's northeast. And a whole bunch of the kind of classic tropes of the city as ideology in China today are visible in this video. The idea of speed, right? How instant the city is, and how it can be created, virtually overnight. The idea of the city as being built tabula rasa, as kind of emerging from nothing. Previous to the city, there was just green space or just kind of empty space, and now there's a city, as opposed to being built on top of an old city or something like that. The idea of the city as something kind of virtual is obviously kind of captured by the immateriality itself of the video representation. And also something that I also want to kind of get you to think about a little bit is the idea of the city as something generic, right? So if you spend any time in China these days, you see promotional videos and images like this all over the place. And they're all kind of the same in their spectacularness, in their excitingness, in their incredible need to show something unique and different. They're all the same. And so there's a generic quality to them as well that is important, and something that I'll kind of go back to. They're mundane in their spectacularness. Here is an image of the actual Lanzhou new area as it is being built today. And taking my cue from what you see going on in this image, I want to suggest that there are two broad ways in which we can understand how urbanization is happening in China today. One is ideological, as I've already been mentioning. The other is infrastructural. One focuses our attention on the city, and you can put quotes around that, as a distinct thing, as its own ontological category. The other, infrastructural, focuses our attention on the connective tissues that both underlie and link cities together, or what we should more think of as kind of population agglomerations rather than cities. Both of these are very powerful drivers of urbanization, of the urbanizing landscape in China. And there's an important tension, or even conflict, or battle going on between the two in China today. And that is kind of what I want to focus on. That tension or conflict between the ideological and the infrastructural, I see going on in this picture. You see the fact that what is actually being built is driven by infrastructural practicalities and infrastructural materialities, some of which kind of fit with the ideological image that you saw in the previous video, but much of which veers off course, like the weird theme park with a replica of the Parthenon. And over there, what's that in the far left? Is that a transformer? Yeah.
That's the transformer.
That's the transformer, sorry. I should show more respect. But also high-speed rail. But I mean, the point is, the way cities actually get built, in terms of the actual material infrastructures, the daily aspect of building the city, that's a chaotic thing in China and anywhere. That has its own kind of unpredictable outcomes, and that we need to understand as, in many ways, linked to a much bigger pattern of processes that can't be isolated into one distinct space called the city, which is what the ideology of the city would like us to do. And so it's a much more complicated picture to see these ideological and infrastructural processes and forces kind of working at odds with each other in China today. But I think that's what gives us a kind of a clearer picture of the actual urbanization that's going on. And so in the talk, I want to kind of walk us through first what I'm talking about when I talk about the city as an ideology, and then talk a little bit about infrastructure and what I mean by that as well. So let's start by just kind of outlining in general terms the city as an ideology. That is, the city as something that is modern, something that represents being civilized, that represents happiness and wealth, and that is kind of the new standard for how we measure progress and how we measure kind of ourselves. This in China is really significant because the city as an ideology has replaced, as I suggested earlier, the ideas of socialist industrialization as the kind of the key driver of China's modernization project. Under the Mao period in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the kind of ideals of socialism were and heavy industrialization specifically, those were the most important ideals that society was working towards, and those were the most important ways that people defined themselves as kind of new national subjects. And that has been replaced by a different kind of subjectivity, not the factory worker, but the urban pedestrian street shopping consumer, right? As you see in these kinds of mock-ups that you see a lot, advertising new real estate developments in China. Spatially, cities during the period of high socialism under Mao, cities were really just containers for these things called the 工作单位, the socialist work, the work unit, which would be based on a factory or something like that. But the city was really kind of secondary to that whole to that spatial organization, and those have been replaced by gated residential communities, pedestrian shopping streets, and so on and so forth as the kind of basis for one's identity. Another aspect of this kind of ideological function of cities is, and this goes of course beyond China, is the idea of the city as a redemptive space, as something that is capable of redeeming the promises of progress and modernization that have gotten lost along the way. Often new urban plans, new towns, new developments promise to get us back on track with all of the ideals of progress and civilization that seem to get lost along the way. So in particular, like when we're thinking of the cities of industrialization, and you think of how people wrote about the Industrial Revolution and the dark satanic mills and the ghettos and the poor neighborhoods and all those kinds of things. New cities have always kind of, building new cities has always kind of promised to get us back on track, to redeem those kind of failings of modernization and set things right again. So the city does important ideological work as a kind of as a redemptive space, and that work continues today. It's still a very powerful idea. So and I was mentioning this in the post-seminar earlier, just last week in the New York Times there was this article about Silicon Valley people imagining the ultimate startup, right? An entire city, kind of how do we reboot society, beyond just better technological devices, we should build better cities. And this quote from the article of people in Silicon Valley fantasizing about newly built cities and how that has become a side gig. They dream of utopias with driverless cars, radical property ownership models, 3D printed houses, and skyscrapers assembled in days, which captures all those tropes of the ideological city that I've been kind of putting out there. So I was just struck at how that continues to be such a dominant kind of, we could think of as hegemonic model. So this urban ideology that I'm attributing to what's going on in China needs to be understood as something that is shared by planners, bureaucrats, politicians, architects, intellectuals of certain stripes, and many others all around the world, not just in China. It is an almost universally accepted vision of progress, advancement, wealth, civilization. Everything gets invested in the idea of an ideal, perfect city. And that still is an incredibly powerful thing. So it's doing ideological work, not just in China, but all around the world. And part of that ideological work depends, as I said, on being able to imagine the city as a thing, as its own unique ontological category, as a separate space. It can only do its work that way, right? It has to be separated apart from the rest of society. Otherwise, how can it be redemptive? How can it be imagined as a utopia? How can it be a kind of, any kind of utopian thinking requires that that whatever you're thinking about be put out of reach, right? It has to be impossible. Otherwise, it's not utopia after all, right? The very term. And that way of thinking about cities, it continues today, but it has its roots that go back a long way, long before the overnight communities were being imagined, of course. But that's another example of how far back it goes. You could talk about the Judeo-Christian ideas that fuel this kind of utopian thinking, if you wanted. But what I was really interested also in how it continues to kind of colonize our imaginations of development and progress and the future. And I saw the most recent example of that for me was in the film Black Panther, and the way Wakanda is imagined as a city, again, the perfect city, with all the kind of standard city tropes of skyscrapers and so on and so forth. So those ideas continue to be very powerful today. So that's some of the kind of outlines of the ideological kind of aspect that I want to kind of get you thinking about. When I talk about infrastructure, then I'm talking about not really a city at all, or not really the city at all as a contained separate kind of thing, but as an assemblage, an accumulation of infrastructures, something that has occurred chaotically, haphazardly over time, over layers. This is a picture that we'll come back to later in the talk. This is the city of Shenzhen, which in many respects, despite its ideological representation as an instant city, something we'll talk about, is actually an infrastructural city that has been built on the foundations of villages and very, very old kind of patterns of inhabitation and settlement that have gone on there. So in that ways, in that respect, it's a pile of accumulations. But on the other hand, the other infrastructural aspect of it that we can talk about is the way that it's part of a larger network that always needs to be thought of, right? It's part of connections that link, in many cases, all over the world. In which case, there's no way to bound it, right? And you can no longer think about it as a separate space because it's networked, it's a connected space. And infrastructure encourages us to think of it that way rather than as distinct. And so this kind of thinking, so here's another kind of idea of that accumulation aspect of it. This is the city of Dongguan, but what I'm wanting to kind of show is when you go around Dongguan, it's such an interesting place. This is this huge city of 8-10 million people just next to Shenzhen, which is a huge city of 20 million. Dongguan is this kind of centerless urban mass, which has been built upon, and to walk around Dongguan is to see all these historical layers. All right, so here you see this kind of socialist housing layer next to a much more, with a much more recent layer behind there of more recent housing developments. But it's kind of, you see the infrastructural city by seeing all these different kind of layers of development that are there. But in terms of broader spatially, you can see kind of images like this, and these come from the Harvard's Urban Theory Lab work on trying to visualize different kind of ways of thinking about infrastructural cities, or infrastructural urbanism, I should say. in terms of thinking about cities as linked to networks of energy production, resource extraction, trade flows, and all these kinds of material processes. So those kinds of ideas go into the idea of an infrastructural approach to urbanization as well. One of my favorite ways of kind of also getting at this is through this film, and I do a lot of the work that I do involves kind of thinking about how film and other kinds of visual, artistic, aesthetic representations and artists who have been working with these ideas in visual ways really help us see things more clearly than theoretical, analytical kinds of forms of representation and writing can do. So one of the best examples of that is this film by Zhao Liang called Behemoth, which is a fantastic film that links coal mining in Inner Mongolia to urbanization going on in China. So I highly recommend it. What it starts out, it's just a lot of long shots of coal mining and coal miners in a way that kind of gives you this strong sense of the way that miners and coal are not that separate, are kind of part of the same general process. So there's a kind of a post-human dimension to it, or a more than human dimension to it that is kind of established in the film of putting people in those same networks of energy and resource materialities, and then extending that to the city, right? And showing how what goes on in the city is really something that needs to be connected to what goes on in a coal mine. And Zhao Liang does that in a way that makes the human part of that network a kind of a central focus, rather than just thinking about it as coal, pipes, roads, whatever. We're all, as people, we're part of this in very basic material terms. And he does some weird kind of symbolic stuff with it as well, which I probably don't need to get into what's going on with the guy carrying the mirror, but it has something to do with Dante's Inferno. And I'll just leave it at that. But it's very infrastructural in those terms, in terms of ways of thinking about what's going on with urbanization in China, and refusing to think of the city as something that can be separated from, say, the coal mine. And this recalls a lot of thinking about urbanization that came out of the Marxist theorist Henri Lefebvre, who wrote this book, The Urban Revolution, over 4 decades ago, in which he made some very provocative arguments that follow along this way of thinking about kind of infrastructural urbanism. Basically, he said that we no longer live in a world that can be thought of as anything other than urban. Right? All of society has become urbanized because of these kinds of connections. Even if we're out in the countryside, we're part of what Neil Brenner calls the operational landscape of the city, in terms of contributing to the metabolic processes that go on in cities. And some of those ideas are controversial, and in the paper version of the talk I try to kind of draw some critical perspectives on those. But I think it's still a very productive and really useful way of thinking about cities in a way that undercuts some of the ideological kind of myth-making that has been going on. So I want to spend a little bit more time. I'm going to go back to the ideological kinds of ways of thinking about cities, because I think it's really helpful to kind of look at all the different tropes and ways, and just to kind of appreciate the ideological power that cities still have and continue to have in China today. And I want to do that in 3 registers. What I'm calling the virtual city, the instant city, and the generic city. And the first of these, the virtual city, I'm going to rely primarily on a kind of a discussion of a film by the director Jia Zhangke. This is a still from that film called 24 City, 20世城记 in Chinese. This is a film that appears to be a documentary that was actually commissioned by It's an actual factory group, a real estate group called the Chengfa Group in Chengdu, the city of Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province. They had this old factory up there in the scene from the film, part of the factory in the upper left corner there. During the 60s and 70s, built airplane combat aircraft, and then started making appliances, and then got shut down, and the group sold the factory eventually in order to build a real estate development called 24 City, there in the lower left. And they commissioned Jia Jianke to make a film about this transition. Interesting enough, to make a documentary about the turning of the factory into a city. And he did it, but because he's such an interesting and creative person, he turned it into a whole different thing, which is really fascinating. So he started out by interviewing actual factory workers and recording their stories. And incredible stories of heroic sacrifice that they made as workers in this factory, of promoting socialism, of building a new China, building the nation. And in many respects, the film is a kind of nostalgic homage to their sacrifices and to an era of China's history when people so powerfully believed in what they were doing that they would sacrifice even their own children in many of these stories in order to achieve that. What they were achieving was communism, was socialism, was incredibly meaningful to them. And their stories are incredibly moving. But also what's really moving, of course, is the tragedy that you feel when all of that starts to mean nothing. When the factory shuts down, they don't really have jobs anymore other than tearing the factory itself down. The film is starting off at a time when everything has already been shut. They're just living there on the factory grounds as part of the old kind of socialist work unit. And all they can do is go in and dismantle everything. And it's incredibly sad. I mean, it's a really sad film because these are kind of like, they're kind of lost souls. Everything they thought they were building has just kind of vanished because everything has moved on. Socialism in terms of industrialization is no longer important. It no longer matters. It's now their children's world. And their children's world is defined by urbanization in the city, not the factory, and it's defined by consumption, not production and labor, right? And so the film then shifts, of course, to the stories of the children and how they how they represent something that is completely new and completely different, and we're kind of left with this very jarring kind of contrast between that. Now, so you would think that this is a kind of a relatively straightforward film that kind of tells a story of first heroism and then kind of pathos, in order to kind of convince people that China's path towards the future is maybe not quite as straightforward as you might have thought. But it's a little bit more complicated than that even, because Jia Jianke, being a very kind of odd, avant-garde, kind of strange filmmaker who likes to dabble in the surreal, decides to toy with our sense of what's real here by replacing putting into some of these key storytelling figures actors who are not actual factory workers, who are not actual children, but who are actors who are telling fictional stories to kind of augment the actual stories being told. And not only does he choose actors to do that, but he chooses some very, very well-known actors. I mean, the first one obviously is the one who plays Suna here in the film, and she's in all of Jia Jianke's films, and everybody knows who she is, right? And so when you see her in the film, you're like, wait a minute, is this fiction or is this a documentary? But the most amazing one is Joan Chen, who is an incredibly famous actress in China, who was well known, and she plays a person who works in the factory, and she starts telling these invented stories about how everybody would make fun of her and call her Little Flower, because that's the name of a character in a very famous movie from China in the 1950s called Little Flower, and the actress in that movie was Joan Chen. it's like postmodern. It's so weird. It's a whole kind of simulacra going on in the film, and it only works, you know, for Western audiences. Foreign audiences watching the film, they don't quite get the joke, but Chinese audiences typically will kind of understand that he's kind of messing with you with this whole thing. And there's a clip that I could show. I don't think I'm going to show it, which kind of plays on some of that. But the point is that there's a surreal dimension to the film, which plays to this notion that Zhao Zhenke is really after, which is this idea that you know, that we kind of in China today live in something of an illusory world. That reality itself is a real mess. It's total chaos, and people generally tend to choose to live in a world in which that chaos is smoothed over in some way. And the city is what's doing that, smoothing it over. The city, the ideological work that the city is doing is kind of covering up that chaos that lies underneath. And what he wants to do in this film is mess with that and show you that what you think is happening with the development of 24th City as a new kind of replacement ideal to socialist industrialization, that is actually kind of quite a facade. And what's going on is actually something quite different. And here's where I would inject the idea of infrastructure as kind of a way of understanding what's going on. And of course, he doesn't go there with that, but he presents us with this really clear message of something that is more of a facade. And that's fairly easy to understand in China today. This is from another film. I thought I had this one in here. Let me see if I can illustrate. That's not going to work. Never mind. This is a short film by a guy named Casper Strack, who what he's showing you is a replica of Paris that is being built outside of Shanghai. It's a town called Tianduchang. And in the film, we start out by seeing this beautiful image of what we think is Paris, but it's actually an advertisement on a billboard outside the city of Tianduchang. And so what we see in the film is, as we start with this image, and then the camera pans back, and you see this as just a billboard, and behind it you see this huge construction chaos of what they're trying to build in actual reality. And it really kind of illustrates that idea of what Zhao Zhenke is trying to get at is you know, what's actually total chaos. And the city as kind of presented ideologically as a way to kind of smooth that over, you know, in the form of a nice Western city or in the form of some kind of other instant city. So that's an important part of the ideological work that's going on. Now, so instant city is another kind of way of thinking about that. Something that has been sweeping across China very much. Is very clear in the Lanzhou Newtown video that I started out with. Urban redemption, the redemptive aspect of the city is something that very much relies on speed, on quickness, on something that has to be built entirely new. And for it to work as redemptive, it has to be built not only new, but has to be built quickly. So in addition to the instant city idea, a very important part of that is the idea of something that gets built entirely new, tabula rasa. So here's the picture that you're seeing here is the Kanbashi New area in the city of Ordos in Inner Mongolia, which is an entirely new city that's being built next to the old city, or that has been built next to the old city of Ordos. So down here is the old city of Ordos, and you can see some old coal mines and things like that. And it's coal mining that is fueling this industrialization. It's also this city that was featured in the film Behemoth that I mentioned earlier, and the coal mining that's going on around here. So here's the old city of Ordos, and then up there in the upper left is the whole new city that's being built. So when they envisioned kind of an idea of how they could use all this coal wealth to improve people's lives and improve the city, they didn't think about ways to improve this space at all. They would build an entirely new one next to it. And only in that way could you redeem the failures of the existing city and create something that's perfect, right? And so here's zeroing in on that city to the left. This is the city of Kangbashi, and I want you to notice a few things about it. First, I want you to notice the geometry of the layout, right? There's a plan there that's very geometrical, with certain kinds of lines and angles that have been clearly thought out. I want you to notice the water. There's a lot of water in here. This isn't a desert, where big expanses like that of water really have no business being there. But again, water has become a very important part of kind of the symbolism of an ideal city in China today. And so, this is meant to be something that we might think of as, or something that the architect Bruno Fortier referred to as a creation city. I want to talk about the idea of the creation city here in a minute, but I want to show this image of the city of Morinx in southern France. And this is a new city that was built in the late 50s, early 60s, I believe. And it was the city that inspired Henri Lefebvre to write a relatively well-known essay called Notes on the New Town, in which he wrote about how these new towns are very powerful ideological edifices, very powerful ideological devices that are really little more, he argued, than machines for living in, fully functional and legible. But it's really kind of an astonishing image to me, the way these buildings have no relationship to their kind of surroundings, the way that they have no relationship to any other town or village that may have pre-existed them. And they really capture this idea of the idea of a creation city that was laid out by the French architect Bruno Fortier. Now, in that, he has these three ideas, or three kind of ideal types or categories of cities that he talks about. The so-called accumulation city, which is a city that evolves without a conscious plan. It's the kind of city that urban planners in the modern era want to fix. And he uses the example of ancient Rome as kind of the classical accumulation city. A mixed city, which is a city that was basically an accumulation city that has a certain degree of urban planning imposed upon it to create certain functionalities. And he talks about ancient Athens in those terms. But then finally, the one I want to focus on the most, the creation city, the idea of a city built entirely new, exactly as it's designed and conceived, purely geometrical, and deterritorial, that is, built tabula rasa, with no kind of reference to the place that it's built in. And Fortier talked about ancient Egyptian cities in those terms, but also the more contemporary example of the city of Brasilia. And that's what we see, in Kangbashi, those kinds of principles at work. Geometry, the idea of, it has to be built quickly, instantly, in order to achieve that aspect of a city that's actually built as it was designed. Because if it takes too long, then things go wrong and things happen and it veers off course. But if you can do it really, really quickly, you can actually have the city that you planned. And this is again where the water comes into place, because that's part of the deterritorial aspect of the city of Kangbashi, right? Water in the desert. It's like Las Vegas too, I suppose, with all the crazy fountains. That same idea. Now it turns out that colonialism is a great canvas in which to practice your creation city dreams, and a lot of architects during the late 18th and early 19th century did exactly this. One, for example, was Edward Lutyens, who was famous for drafting the kind of colonial master plan for New Delhi, which follows all these same kind of creation city principles of geometric layout, of something that's built precisely as it was conceived and designed. There are many other colonial examples of this. The point is that if the creation city was so enabled by colonialism, there's a clear power issue that needs to be taken into account when thinking about the creation city. Creation cities require an authoritarian kind of power to make them possible. They don't tend to happen democratically. And that's partly also why we see them resurging so much in China, or at least a version of them. But not only are they resurging in China, but they're being enabled by global kind of multinational architectural and design firms that are making a lot of money selling these kinds of cities in a box, some almost kind of city off the shelf. Doesn't matter where you put it, it's a creation city after all. It doesn't have to be territorial, it can just be plopped down anywhere. And already preconceived, already designed, replicable across the landscape. That's certainly the case with Meishi Lake Town in Changsha, which is a twin city outside of Shanghai, Changsha and Hunan, that's being designed by a consortium of British and American design firms. Here's a quote: Meishi Lake establishes a paradigm of living in balance with nature and offers a new model for the future of the Chinese city and development around the world. A lot of the kind of creation city utopianism there. But Meishi Lake Newtown, one of the kind of key partners is Gale International, and who were also the key people who were involved in the designing and building of New Songdo in South Korea, near the airport outside of Seoul, which kind of speaks to the replicability of these kinds of creation cities. There's others that we could talk about. For example, the Sino-Singapore Tianjin Eco-City being built outside of Tianjin, which also has a lot of the creation city utopianism. A lot of that utopianism in China today is being expressed in terms of smart city, eco-city kind of templates that are being put in place by various corporations who get big contracts to develop the infrastructures for these cities. But a key quote that I keep coming back to by this woman, Fanny Hoffman-Loss, who was the chief architect for the Nanhui New City outside of Shanghai, really kind of gives the game away in many respects, right? With a completely new development, you can try to form a new ideal city, right? You have to have it in a new place, a whole new city, not building on top of the old one. Meaning that you also form a kind of ideal society without any history behind it. So that's the other aspect of the instant city ideology, right? Is the city without history. That's really important. History is nothing but a baggage that gets in your way. And that idea of the city without history is how people in China refer to the city of Shenzhen. It is in many respects the poster child of kind of utopian creation cityism in China today. It is rhetorically kind of discussed over and over again as the city that was built from nothing. You know, back in the early 80s when Chris and I were first going to China, and it was just a new special economic zone. It was nothing more than just a kind of a fishing village, people like to say. So the architect and theorist Rem Koolhaas has thought a lot about Shenzhen. He spent some time there, and he came up with this idea of the generic city as a way of thinking about Shenzhen as a creation city. And he got a lot of provocative, he got a lot of the idea right, I think, but he misread what was going on in Shenzhen in equally important ways. So for Koolhaas, and this is the third kind of register of how we think about ideology in cities in China today, for Koolhaas, the generic city is what he saw as kind of what replaces the historical city. This is all the cities in Europe and North America, they're all historical kind of accumulation cities, but he said what we see going on in Asia now, and in particular the Pearl River Delta area of China where Shenzhen is, we see a whole new kind of urbanism coming along that has no history to it, right? It's simply where there used to be a city, now there's generic cities being built, and they've kind of erased the history behind them because they've been built without any regard to the historical identity that might have otherwise underlied them. They all issue from tabula rasa, If there was nothing, now they are there. If there was something, they have replaced it. They must, otherwise they would be historic. So the generic city, again, kind of the opposite of a historic city, and this is very much something that we saw going on in China, well, in Shenzhen. But in many respects, this really misunderstands what's actually going on, or what actually underlies the development of a place like Shenzhen. I'm going to read a little bit from the paper so that I don't get too off track with this part of the discussion, because this is kind of crucial to the bigger picture that I'm trying to portray here. What the generic city idea as wielded by Koulos profoundly misunderstands is that the kind of urbanization going on in the Pearl River Delta in places like Shenzhen today is not the result of tabula rasa city building, but of particular and peculiar histories of territorial administration, state population and production management, and village identities that date back in some cases nearly a millennium. Shenzhen then is hardly a city without history, despite its ideological preference to be viewed as such. In this sense, Koolhaas's generic city merely enables that ideological rendering and helps erase the histories and geographies that condition China's ultimate urban model, Shenzhen. Shenzhen emerged not simply as a single special economic zone, but as a cluster of exceptional zones built up around dispersed nodes of manufacturing. These nodes were themselves village-based, the spatial outcome of a bargain between villagers and zone leaders who, in exchange for the expropriation of agricultural land, allowed villagers to retain sizable parcels of development land upon which to build export processing plants, often in partnership with Hong Kong investors, many of whom were themselves natives of these very villages. After 2 decades, beginning in the early 1980s, of relentless haphazard development, Shenzhen was a city without a center, an archipelago of vernacular urbanisms, and in this pattern, villages themselves were the starting point of urbanization. If you go to Shenzhen now, you see a lot of kind of, you go to museums and you see a lot of kind of representations of this idea of Shenzhen speed, of building something from nothing, and you see a lot of ways that the kind of the village history of that place gets erased. Here's a model of Dongguan. Urbanization in Shenzhen and throughout the Pearl River Delta originated in the industrialization and densification of villages and towns, rather than from the expansion of the central city. In many respects, the generic city is not a city at all, but a collection of urbanized villages and towns. That much was admitted to me by a Dongguan city planner in 2017, when he said, actually, Dongguan doesn't exist. Meaning, it doesn't exist as a city. Despite its bulging population of nearly 10 million and its leading role among China's export manufacturing regions. While the generic city landscape of the Pearl River Delta that inspired Rem Koolhaas is certainly anti-design and ad hoc, like he argued, then it is not exactly tabula rasa, built from nothing. Built without design from the infrastructures of haphazard rural urbanization, the generic city is in many ways the opposite of the creation city. That fact has required that a creation city be imposed upon it ex post facto, what we see going on with this kind of model. The resulting blend of formal urbanism in the imposition of formal central business districts and their geometric layouts and iconic skylines, and informal urbanized villages constitutes this kind of actual tension going on between the historical kind of infrastructural city and the ideological city that is trying to be imposed upon it. And that's what's actually kind of going on. So the generic city idea, what I use this kind of as a transition to this very last section of the paper, just bear with me, to kind of say that, Koolhaas gets a lot right about this idea. There is an infrastructural aspect to the generic city, but what he misses is that historical layers that are very much a part of this story as well. And those, here we are back at this image, right? Those historical layers are very much clear to me anyway, in this image, which, you know, which show a village that has become urbanized and yet is its own kind of unique infrastructural landscape. And in many ways, when you go around Shenzhen, you are walking around a city of villages in which the vast majority, particularly of the working people who live in Shenzhen, but over half of Shenzhen's entire population, 20 million people, living in these incredibly dense concentrations that were once farming villages that have kind of been turned over to really low rent. You know, people would think of them, people would often call them ghettos. They are the kind of pariahs of the urban landscape as far as the urban government is concerned. They're constantly being demolished or under the threat of demolition. And yet they're where the actual kind of street life and culture of the city thrives in terms of a livable space. So in many respects, as an infrastructural city, Shenzhen is a city of villages. As an ideological city, it's a city without villages, as it was officially declared to be in the year 2004 by the city government, which by a stroke of a pen basically said that there's no such thing as a village in Shenzhen anymore. Legally, that designation has disappeared as an administrative designation. And as such, therefore, the urban government then has the right and ability to demolish them and rid the urban landscape of this kind of blight that interferes with the kind of ideological message of Shenzhen as the instant generic city that it wants to be, or maybe not generic, but certainly instant creation city that it wants to be represented as. And so this has also then become part of the kind of the landscape of Shenzhen, this landscape of demolition as kind of the war zone between the ideological and the infrastructural city, as in this case, the urban village of Baishuzhou. Many urban villages have gotten the message very clearly that either they face destruction as a kind of a vernacular infrastructure to the city that interferes with the ideology of the city, or they become themselves ideological, which you have happening in many of the urban villages that have transformed themselves into symbolic spaces that represent on a village scale the same kind of ideological message that the city itself is trying to present. And so you see a lot of that going on in some of these relatively wealthy urban villages like Huanggang or Xiaxia, which have turned themselves into kind of spectacle landscapes that portray both the village identity as well as the more modern idea of urban civilization that the ideology of the city seeks to represent. But the battleground is still there, and it's still the case in a place like Hubei village, where an intense fight is going on right now over whether or not to demolish or preserve it, and how that is going to play out. So there are many spaces still in the city that are affordable, that are livable, that have a lot of kind of street life to them, and so much of the battle is that's a big part of kind of what an infrastructural perspective on the city would have us focus on. And I'll finish then with a final image of, and this is not Shenzhen, but this is in the city of Beijing, and that's Zaha Hadid's Galaxy Soho complex. I don't know how many of you in Beijing have seen this building. She won an award for this building, which I think is criminal. I think this is a horrible building in the way that it's kind of plopped down in the middle of a working neighborhood and says, look at me, look at me, look at me. Look how beautiful and important I am. This is the ideology of the city in a single building, in a single material edifice. But I like the image because what it shows is nobody's really paying any attention to the building because they're too busy getting along with their everyday lives.
And are they in a hutong, or is that not so?
It may have been a hutong at one point, but it's long since kind of been vernacularized into something else.
Right.
There's a lot of these neighborhoods that are working neighborhoods that are they're not pretty neighborhoods. urban villages in Shenzhen are not pretty neighborhoods. They're not nice. Some of them are problematic in terms of crime and things like that the government always says. But they are, in many respects, the only livable spaces in the city. And they continue to be. And so that's kind of partly a big part of what's at stake. And you know, people will continue making those kinds of livable spaces in the cities. And so at the end of the day, the whole kind of infrastructural approach that I'm trying to kind of lay out there as an additional way of thinking about urbanization in China that undercuts the ideological is to pay attention to this kind of stuff. The prosaic, the everyday ways that people actually use and make the city. And that always escapes ideology. It always gets beyond it and away from it. And I think an infrastructural perspective allows us to see that. So, thank you so much for your
There's time for a few questions, and if anyone wants to talk to Tim after the questions, you certainly should come up and do that. So, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm interested in like the construction of new subjects after like the fall of like Marxist-Leninist
Yeah.
Maoism.
Yeah.
So like I'm worried just about like how much agency we're offering actual Chinese citizens, because this notion that like there was this vacuum that they couldn't fill up kind of worries me, because it feels like we're infantilizing them as if like they were too childish to be able to figure out or reconfigure the new identities, despite the fact that like they had Taoism before and like it wasn't like the history started when like white philosophies began to pervade into China. So like how would you, I don't know, what's your general response to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I really agree with pretty much everything you put out there. I do think that it's that whole notion of a kind of a spiritual vacuum in China is a problematic one to put out there. Because it probably overstates whatever meaning Marxism, Leninism may have had to a certain extent, and doesn't give an earlier subjectivity the credit for being able to kind of work and play with that in really creative ways. But we do know that always happened in China, right? That Chinese people were always, if not cynical, then at least very creative with the ways that they played with the ideologies that were being put out there, right? And so that always needs to be taken into account. I think part of what Jia Zhangke is doing in the film 24th City, in kind of what the film ends up doing, I think, is laying out the absurdity of a pure account that would simply take at face value the idea of the socialist workers that were willing to sacrifice anything in order to achieve industrialization, right? Part of what he's doing in the film is kind of throwing that idea up in the air and saying, that's kind of ridiculous. But he does it in a very subtle way. One of the ways he does it is by, there's a woman in the film who tells this incredibly anguished story about how on her way, being moved from the factory's previous location in the northeast of China to its location in Chengdu, in order to get away from Korea and those kinds of things, to make it more strategic. And this is true. This did happen. They were all going up the Yangtze River in a boat, and they get off the boat at one point in port, and she loses track of her 3-year-old son, and then they have to get back on the boat and they leave. But so committed was she to having to go to the factory and work that, it's like she had to leave her child behind. Duty called, and it's an incredibly sad story, and she's crying, and we're all crying, and then you think, this is crazy. This is not, this is almost absurd, and it's almost like, and this is one of the fictional stories. This is not a true story that he puts in the film, and it's told by an actor in the film. And so, on reflection, you go, wait, there's something else going on here, and it's very subtle, but I really think that that's a big part of it. So I think you're right on track in terms of saying, yeah, that kind of victimization or that robbing of agency, or however you want to put it, is a really important kind of thing to keep front and center in the way we think about this. And it's the same thing with kind of thinking about the ideology of cities today and the ideological work that they do today. We were talking about this in the pro seminar a little bit, weren't we? About how people always will find ways of poking fun at, appropriating, turning those ideologies on their head. Nobody, this kind of spectacle of instant city in China, people are not blown away by this as much as you might think they are in China. And that's always an important thing to remember. There's a guy who writes a lot about infrastructure, so I'm going off about this, but I'll just say one more thing. One of the key kind of infrastructure studies people who writes a lot about this kind of stuff is this guy, Brian Larkin, who's an anthropologist, who's written about colonial infrastructure development in Africa. And he has this term that he uses called the colonial sublime. And he uses that to kind of say how colonized people were meant to be blown over by the technological advancement of the colonizer. And so it was really important for the colonizer to build big bridges and big dams to kind of, that were both horrific and magisterial. It's kind of that definition of sublime, which is both beautiful and horrible at the same time, because it's so overpowering. He kind of puts that out there, but he doesn't do enough critical work, I don't think, to kind of address this issue that people weren't necessarily so taken with these things as we might assume. Thanks. I promise not to go on as long with the next question.
It seems like that critique could have been leveled at Kulats and Brenner in some ways. And
Yeah.
I'm glad that was brought out,
Yeah.
because it feels like they were infantilizing in certain kinds of ways.
We do that as scholars in general, right?
It happens. The generalizations
We do that.
can be really
Well, we
problematic.
have a tendency to believe in the structures that we conjure in our ideas
right.
more than we should.
Following the theme of undisciplined.
Right, exactly.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I was just wondering what you thought the role of the Corbusier is like with respect to these big tall towers and glassy vistas. I always think that he's like a major sort of.
The classic, the kind of the quintessential modernist architect planner.
But also like projects like in American cities. I think they're sort of like.
Yeah, it reminds me of Scott's work with Corbusier and seeing like a state.
Fully legible, functional types of urban landscapes, right? That were meant to be totalizing, all-encompassing, right? That would encompass all the needs that people could possibly have in an efficient use of space. So with those ideas were very powerful in China. They continue to be in many ways. Very powerful in the way planners in China today think about how urban space needs to be organized. So you often have everything has to be kind of an eco-city and a garden city, and often all that means is having a certain amount of space in between all these big buildings, which just becomes dead, useless, ridiculous space.
That is what I really worry.
It's manicured, it's nice, there's parks, there's trees, there's nice little windy paths, there's even like classical Chinese gardens that they're building in between these skyscraper residential apartment blocks, and it's all very civilized, and it's all very heritagey, and it's like national even because it's like a classical Chinese garden or something, but those are useless spaces. Nobody uses them. In terms of kind of taking a leisurely stroll, that there's kind of when you see the rendering that the architect does of what it's going to look like, and you always see these kind of anonymous people walking hand in hand or strolling through these kind of spaces, and they never really get used that way. So, so those kinds of open spaces become just as ideological, I guess, as anything else. I don't know if that's part of what you were getting at, but yeah. I think those ideas still remain very, very powerful in China, in the urban planning ideas. Yeah.
Just going off of what you were just talking about, having cities that aren't built for pedestrians, it seems, having these massive sprawling complex of thousands of people stacked on one another. It's interesting because I recently found out that China has put a lot of money into the infrastructure system on monorail.
Yeah.
of 36,000 miles of new rail or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
And I think my question to you is, as someone who studies China, what comes first? Is it the actual base infrastructure of people running rail lines through and then sort of bringing up a town after? Or is it really building it first and then having people come just because there's no city? Because I've heard of these ghost town cities,
Ghost cities, yeah.
where for the last 20 years a city's been built and no one showed up.
Right.
And sometimes it could be lack of opportunity, but sometimes it has just been they're too big
Right.
for people to fully inhabit.
Yeah, there's a lot of that goes on. A lot of the kind of you build the kind of infrastructural first, and then hope that it fills up. And they do kind of end up eventually filling up, and they get a lot wrong along the way. But that's a huge thing going on. Still going on in China today. The Ordos city that I showed the Google images is kind of the poster child of the ghost city phenomenon in China. A lot of that is happening. So what other ways? There's lots of other ways you can think about infrastructure and infrastructural urbanism in China. One is this idea of infrastructure as a spatial fix for capital accumulation, right? So anything that's producing a lot of capital needs to get that capital needs to get invested in something. And so real estate has become the primary option for investment of liquid capital in China, because it's seen as a far more risk-free, stable kind of investment than anything else. First of all, there's no property tax in China, right? So there's no cost to building something empty that just is going to sit empty. It's not going to cost you anything because you're not paying a tax on it. You're not, So there's a lot of weird kind of things in the way the financial and economic structure of the country works to kind of encourage. The other thing that happens is the whole political structure, the way officials get office and the way they get promoted has a lot to do with being able to kind of show in a very short period of time some really big change that they've done. And that's usually typical, how did GDP per capita increase in the 3 years that I was the official of this particular territory? And the easiest way to do that is to invest tons into real estate, which then translates into numbers. And so all that's going on to fuel that kind of ghost city thing. So that's a big part of what's driving this. You mentioned though one other thing which I thought was interesting, and that's the car culture, right? So there's a couple of different ways of thinking about how that's been going on in China. Koolhaas's idea of the generic city, and this goes back in some respects to Courvoisier too, who was of course a big fan of the car, right? Who thought that cities needed to be designed around cars rather than the other way around, right? That was why a city like Paris needed to be bulldozed as far as he was concerned and replaced with these tower blocks and apartment garage and car garages and things like that, because he saw the automobile as kind of the ultimate kind of expression of freedom and mobility. So the generic city for Koolhaas also is a car city. And Koolhaas just throws that out there just to be annoying, I think, because so many urbanists of today like to think of the carless city and the kind of eco-city and things like that. And Koolhaas said, no, you can dream all you want, but the cities that are being built in Asia are car cities, and that's the city of the future, just like Courvoisier kind of said. And that is true. When you go to Shenzhen, it's a car city, the way it's been built, and Dongguan, everything's being built around the car, and that's still very much part of what's going on. And yet, at the same time, you see everybody dreaming about a city like this. And so the cities that are being, when the creation city ideology is being articulated, it's almost always a carless city, which is really interesting. So this particular city, which will probably never be built, Tianfu district outside of Chengdu, has been envisioned as a city that you park your car on the outskirts of, or probably maybe even in some underground garage, and never use. And so that has become kind of the holy grail of ideological kind of utopian urbanism in China today. So it's interesting thinking about that as evolved.
One more question, and then you can come up and talk to Tim.
Yeah.
There are some scholars who conceive of cities as civilization's bulwark against time to stave off the advance of entropy. So if we put ourselves in the mindset of these new cities which don't have a future, which don't have a past, how would they experience the passage of time? Like if we put ourselves in the mindset of a city, not a city dweller, but in the city itself.
But they do have a past, right?
Right.
So, I mean, that's the thing. So there's an ideology of the city without a past, but it's never the case. All the cities that have been built as creation cities deny a past that was actually there. Right? So it's something that never really gets realized in those terms.
So,
I don't know if that really answers your question, but it takes it in a different direction.
All right, well, come up and ask some more
Yeah.
questions, and thank you very much. Thank you.